SARS has introduced a new enhanced tax clearance status system. Give me a sense of what we're talking about here, Jashwin. What does this mean for the taxpayer, whether they are a corporate citizen or just a straightforward individual? What does this mean?
Yeah, so just very high-level synopsis, basics of the new process is SARS has implemented what they call approval international transfer. All right? Now, what that serves to do is it has taken the foreign investment allowance as well as the financial immigration process, which previously were two separate compliance processes, and streamlined it into a single process. Now, in doing so, in terms of your tax compliance, your options are approval international transfer and good standing. Now, you'll remember historically there was a tender option because, let's be honest, South Africa is ripe for tenders. And that tender option has been removed. And it's probably something, the Australian authorities should consider in light of this whole PwC debacle. But it's definitely something that is a step towards more stringent tax treatment. So that is the new process. Now, what this translates to for South Africans, for individual South Africans, is for your South African tax residents, the annual transfer of any amount in excess of R1 million per annum requires an approval international transfer application and authorization from SARS, making it a little bit more difficult to get money out because historically your single discretionary of R1 million, that's still in place, and then you had your foreign investment allowance of R10 million. So there was always a bit of a gray area between that 1 and 10, and currently, even if it's R1,100,000, you will require an AIT process to be completed.
And of course, that means a tax clearance certificate that shows that you're compliant in that sense?
No, so it goes beyond that. So step one is your tax compliance. Now, you must then submit an actual application together with supporting documents verifying the source of the funds, a reconciliation of your assets and liabilities over a minimum of the last 3 years to evidence that your transferable funds and your liquidity was appropriately sourced and having been historically accurately taxed. And then you've got to disclose the purpose of the transfer, saying, this is the exchange it's going to, this is the investment policy it's going into, and I want to buy a property in Cyprus, and these are the source documents. This is my means analysis to say I can afford it based on A, B, C, and D, and this is where it's going. This is going to be the investment property. So the paper trail burden has become quite stringent, quite heavy, and it is something that, especially when you're looking at larger sums, needs to be navigated very much at the onset rather than at the last minute, just pre-submission of that application.
Delano, the disparity and I suppose the gray area between that 1 million mark and that 10 million mark is obviously something that would have been quite controversial, quite something that would have created a lot of conversation for people that are in that kind of tax bracket to be able to move that kind of money. Explain it to us. What is this disparity? What is the difference between this 1 million rand that can go out versus the 10 million rands? Just solidify it in our minds for us, please.
So I think just before we solidify that gray area of the two amounts, let's just create a framework of the conversation around tax residency status. So if I can just put it briefly, the starting point is that South Africa's current taxation system is residence-based. And what that means is when SARS views a taxpayer like you and myself and Jashwin, it are you a tax resident in South Africa? Alternatively, are you a non-tax resident in South Africa? Between those two statuses is a very big tax treatment difference. On the one end, if you are a tax resident in South Africa, and this is regardless of where you are in the world, SARS' taxing right over your income, it's a net that spans globally. So it will be your worldwide income. On the other hand, if you're a non-tax resident in South Africa, that same taxing net is reduced only to the confines of the borders of South Africa. So it's a lot smaller. And what's very important to note is that that would mean every time a taxpayer decides to update their tax residency status to non-resident, the South African fiscus is actually suffering because the taxing net that SARS has is actually smaller. And because of that, SARS has to undergo its stringent verification processes to determine on what basis legally does this individual qualify to be a non-tax resident. Now, with that backdrop, you have a conversation that usually mirrors residency, and it's the inward and outward flow of money. So is there a distinction to be made when I have inward and outward flow transactions made as a tax resident in South Africa as opposed to a non-tax resident in South Africa? And this then ties into, well, why do we have certain categories of amounts for purposes of outward transactions that range in certain millions? So as a tax resident, as Jashwin mentioned, the well-known Single Discretionary Allowance of up to 1 million rand per calendar year. But that million is only for
outward monies, outward flowing.
Outward flow. Outward flow. Now, when it comes to a non-tax resident, and before we even consider that area of more than 1 million, if you have a non-tax resident, it's usually involving an individual who is outside of South Africa. And their circumstances can vary. So one example could be that maybe I'm outside of South Africa. I'd like to become a non-tax resident. And parallel to that process, I'm actually disposing of my former primary residence in South Africa. And once that sale goes through and the transfer is successful, I'm going to have a lump sum amount in an account. And then you start to gauge, well, how do I get that money outside of South Africa in that particular example? Alternatively, if I were a beneficiary to a deceased estate and I've inherited money, but I am overseas because I've financially immigrated and I'm permanently abroad, how then do I get the funds outside of South Africa? Then you start to understand, well, how can certain amounts be higher than 1 million, even for the ordinary person, in whatever class it may be.
So, Jashwin, let me come back, because we did touch on this issue of a tax resident person and a non-tax resident person, and it's becoming clearer to me what we're talking about when we speak of a tax resident resident individual who doesn't necessarily have to be living in South Africa physically, as Delano has just said. But talk to me about the discretionary million. That is for tax resident people. What is the discretionary amount for non-tax resident people?
So non-tax resident people don't get one. So the tax resident. So here's where it gets tricky. So as you know, South Africa, residency-based tax system, which means whether you live here, whether you don't live here, as long as you're a resident, you're contributing to the tax base, right? So as a little thank you, you get a 1 million single discretionary allowance. Now, if you're a non-resident, but let's say you're still working in South Africa, so there's still taxation withheld at source to an extent on your South African sourced income, or deemed to be South African sourced income only.
Yes.
But because you are not making that wider contribution to the tax base, you don't get any nice things, which means you don't get a single discretionary allowance. Now, for a non-South African tax resident, or as I prefer to classify for AIT purposes, someone who has ceded their tax residency, so a cession of residency has formally taken place, to get the money out under the AIT process, firstly, it's any amount, requires an AIT application, whether it's $100, whether it's $1 million, whether it's $10 million. You need the AIT. You're not a resident, you don't get the benefit of being a resident. And it goes a step further, because the AIT must be applied for by an individual, right? Point one.
Yeah.
In order to do that, that individual must have a South African tax number, which means if you have seized your residency 10 years ago, you have deregistered with SARS, right? Because that's what it means. You formal session, provide it, you get your non-resident letter, it's all good and well. 10 years ago. Now, your great uncle passes away and you're entitled to an inheritance of R500,000. Great. If you were a resident and you want to take the money out, single discretionary allowance, and you're good to go. Because you're a non-resident, you must now register a tax number with SARS. You must then use that tax number to submit your AIT application. Or alternatively, if you want to use a tax practitioner, accountant, attorney, etc., they must have a valid power of attorney, which is also submitted to SARS. And you then need that formal approval to move any amount of funds out of South Africa. The inheritance, that's a bit of a hairy one, because you also need a final liquidation and distribution account. And that puts you in a little bit of a catch-22, because you can't finalize if the estate's not compliant. The estate is not compliant, then you can't move any funds because there's non-compliance. So it's really a vicious cycle. And don't even get me started on a distribution from a South African trust, because that's common. That is so common, especially for those wealthy families with the old money.
Yeah.
Now they would have set up a trust 50, 60, 70 years ago. Good money, big money in there. Own a couple farms, own various rental properties, maybe a business or two. And as the generations go, you've seen it, younger generation, brain drain, they want to go to the Netherlands. They want to, previously they'd want to go to Australia, but currently it looks like Down Under's going under from a tax and compliance perspective, so maybe not so much. But they want out.
Yeah.
So
at least they want out of South Africa, yeah?
And they want out of South Africa, and I think if we take it a step further, if we're looking at this new Gen Z or whatever they're called, I think they just want out of employment overall and want to live as hippies. But that's just my opinion. Now, yeah, man, you see it. We see it all the time with these youngsters. They're just built differently, eh?
Yeah.
But just continuing back on course, it's really a case of, okay, your kids or your grandkids, they've seized their residency, they're in the Netherlands, happy wife, kids, and they're officially tax resident in the Netherlands. Hell, maybe they even got citizenship there. Now, in order for them to receive a distribution from the trust, and most of the time we see that distributions kick in at 25, 30, 35, and only then does the trust actually make distributions to benefit certain beneficiaries. And for them to actually receive that, because they're non-residents, they must now register a South African tax number, and for each...
But by registering a South African tax number, does that mean they become tax resident again in South Africa?
No, it does not. It does not. So they can register the tax number. It means they have a filing obligation, right? So they file a tax return, but it does not change their residency status. It's the same way that an expatriate, right? So rotating between, say, South Africa and Dubai, because their assignment is in Dubai or the DRC or wherever the case is. It works on a day's test, and that is definitely Delano's forte when it comes to your residency and your double taxation, all of that. So he can do a deep dive there.
Yeah.
But when it comes to actually getting that money out, you're going to need an AIT for each movement of funds. So the AIT is required per fund movement and not per source of funds per movement. So if you have one movement for 10 million and there are 5 different sources of funds that contribute to that movement, it's a single application. Yet if you have 10 movements for let's say, 1 million each in a given year of assessment, and again, for a non-resident, then each one requires its own AIT, regardless of if they come from the same source. Now, inheritance is distribution from a trust, is particularly tricky because you have got to evidence an enormous amount of documentary proof. You've got to submit the trust deed, you've got to submit the bank statements for the trust, you've got to submit the bank statements for the beneficiary, you've got to show that that distribution has happened, you've got to confirm there's sufficient transferable liquid capital, you have to also then prove source of that for the trust. And it becomes sticky when it's a case of, okay, the original income generating asset was acquired 50 years ago. Because what our law says is, from a documentary perspective, legally you must keep documents for a period of 5 years. So how do you paper trail yourself back to 50 years when there were no emails, there was no cloud, there was nothing? So that's, the AIT, to an extent, because it's such a heavy documentary burden, it does open up a window, even if it's just a crack, for SARS to actually look deeper into wealthy taxpayers and sources of wealth.
Right. Let me get our listeners involved in this conversation. Here, Bafuti, did you know? Because I suppose many of us are not in that tax bracket where we want to move R1 million in or out. We hardly even know that we are tax resident or not tax resident. But this is a great learning moment for us. That we need to understand that you are tax resident in South Africa. It means, therefore, that SARS has a net that has access to your income and the taxes thereof, regardless of where you are making that money from. Yeah? But if you're not...
That is 100% correct.
Yeah.
And I'll take it one step further.
Yeah.
Just to verbalize it per SARS, per the legislation.
Yeah.
As a South African resident, you are subject to taxation in South Africa on your worldwide income.
Wow.
And you must declare your worldwide assets. Even if it's a bank account in the Cayman Islands, if you have a property in the Seychelles for the last 10, 15 years as a rental, that source is irrelevant. It's your residency that binds you from a taxing perspective.
Delano,
Pre-2001, then we were still on source-based.
Yeah.
So for the South African source, it's taxed in South Africa. Once we move to residency, and Delano, I'm going to hand over to you here because residency, you live it.
So I want to go into this residency thing and make it again clear to those of us who are perhaps not swimming around in those ponds in terms of our income, to understand that when we're speaking about residency here, we're talking about tax residency, not citizenship, right? Because that distinction needs to be clear in our minds as we have this conversation, that there is your tax residency and your citizenship, and you can be a resident tax-wise and not necessarily be a citizen. And you can be a citizen and not necessarily be a tax resident. Is that true, Delano?
That's spot on. The way I like to think about it, citizenship, Home Affairs has a building, tax residency, SARS as a building.
Right, right. Now, I want you to go back, Delano, to that issue of the disparity between that 1 million and that 10 million issue that we started talking about, where you very clearly explained to us the background that we need to understand as we have this conversation with regards to tax residency versus citizenry and so forth. What is the issue between that 1 million rand tax, that 1 million discretionary amount that you can take out if you are tax resident, and that 10 million? What is the issue? What is that gray area that seems to be quite big? Explain that.
So if we take it back to what the position was prior to the AIT introduction from 24 April this year, if you were a tax resident, you had your single discretionary allowance of up to 1 million rand, provided you're a natural person and you're older than the age of 18.
So this is not for corporates, this is not for trusts, this is for a natural person.
A natural person.
Wow.
Right?
Yep.
Now, to some degree, in addition to your single discretionary allowance of 1 million, the question is, well, if I need to take out more than 1 million, what facility do I really have? And what is the range of the facility? So previously, the facility was your foreign investment allowance, where you required a compliance PIN to actually be issued to you by SARS. Right? And the simple way to think about it is, if that facility is 10 million on top of my 1 million single discretionary allowance, I ultimately have a facility of taking out up to 11 million rand from South Africa per calendar year.
Yeah.
But the 10 million becomes interesting because what you really need to look at is, if compliance is a big requirement for me to get a PIN in order to have approval to take that facility of funds out, it means that SARS wants me to make good on any tax debt or tax liability I may have, and for that to be settled before I get a status that gives me a compliance PIN. So if I want to take 10 million and I had a tax debt of 3 million, in other words, please pay your 3 million first and you can take out 7 million. Then we know you're tax compliant, and I think that's a good way, in my view, to understand that additional 10 million.
Right. So this sounds like Donkey Kong. I mean, you guys will remember what Donkey Kong is. It sounds like different levels of compliance, but then you're allowed to a greater portion of world markets and world opportunities if you have achieved certain things. I mean, I'm just having images of Donkey Kong as we speak. Why, Delano, would some people want to remain tax resident and some people want to relinquish or cede their tax residency in South Africa? What are the perks? Why? And then talk to me of the South African economy, what it gets and what it loses with this new dispensation.
Okay, so if you look at tax resident status in South Africa, you know that SARS can tax worldwide income. But throughout your career or your employment life cycle, you might find yourself acquiring employment or securing employment abroad. And the question becomes, if I am abroad, do I maintain my status as a tax resident in South Africa? And if I do so, well, is there a tax burden for me maintaining that status and not choosing to seize my South African tax residency status? So you could be abroad, and let's say you're in the UAE, let's say you earning on an annualized basis 4 million rand per year. I'm in the UAE and I'm a tax resident. Even though I'm working and rendering services in the UAE, I have to still pay tax in South Africa. because the principle is that a tax resident is taxed on worldwide income. Now, one of the perks of being a tax resident is that you can utilize an exemption, the so-called expat exemption. And what it does is it allows you to reduce your taxable income up to 1.25 million rand per year. But now you have a situation of 1.25 million still leaves me with a tax burden in South Africa, because the difference is what falls within that global net, that worldwide net.
Yes.
Now, you often find that an expatriate in that situation would opt to become a non-tax resident instead, because from a principal stance, a non-tax resident can only be taxed on income gleaned or sourced within South Africa. So that full 4 million outside, that's non-taxable from a South African tax perspective.
Is it taxable? Is it taxable though by the source? In other words, if I'm in the UAE and I'm generating that income in the UAE, can the UAE still tax that 4 million rand?
So from a principal perspective, yes, but in the UAE, there is no taxing obligation. There's a taxing right that the UAE has. But expats who are there and decide to be non-tax residents, they enjoy the benefit of that jurisdiction not imposing an income tax obligation.
I'm getting a sense that prior to April 2024, and the new what are we calling this thing? The new AIT, is it the AIT?
Correct.
South Africa would have been a desirable tax haven for people who are earning big amounts of money, and were perhaps not subject to this global tax net. That now we are probably going to see a flight of formerly tax resident people with big money because of this kind of red tape, Delano?
I think in the context of South Africa's economy currently, and given its track record of recent years, there is certainly there's certainly been an emphasis on not only a skills shortage in the country, but also individuals deciding to leave South Africa. But when they leave South Africa, and should they want to be a non-tax resident, they have a choice. They can either become a non-tax resident on a temporary basis. In other words, SARS, I'm going abroad. If this country has a double tax agreement with South Africa and I meet certain requirements, you will regard me as a non-tax resident for that stint. Maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 5 years. Alternatively, you could become a non-tax resident on a permanent basis. Then it's not dependent on whether the country has an agreement with South Africa on a treaty level. It simply means, SARS, I am going to be abroad permanently. That is my intention. I might return to South Africa for short stays and holidays, but for purposes of living and what I regard as my real home, it will not be South Africa. And that in some instances can be an emotional decision for an expat to cut ties with the South African fiscus. And where that is the case, and there is a possible option to utilize a double tax agreement to have your temporary non-resident tax status. So you still have the benefit of only being taxed on income sourced within South Africa. They will opt for that instead.
What is a double tax agreement, Delano?
Well, it's just an agreement between two contracting states which deals with a variety of things, one of which is the allocation of taxing rights. And you often find that South Africa's entering into these double tax agreements stems from a global economic perspective and viewing other countries as trade partners. So we envisage that people in our country will be working in your country and vice versa. And we would not want a situation where our people are double taxed or suffer a tax burden just because of the arrangement. So strategically, through an OECD convention model being placed for many countries to kind of follow the same model, so there's a similarity in how countries allocate taxing rights, you find that it's pretty much similar in most cases. And it allows you then to use this DTA route as an avenue to formally seize your tax residency with SARS.
Jashwin, I made reference to Donkey Kong, and the idea that as you comply and therefore win one level, you go to the next level, and being on the next level, I suppose, gives you some exposure to opportunities of a global nature without necessarily having to be taxed in ways that you don't want to be taxed. I go back to the question, and I would like to hear your thoughts from your perspective as to the implications for the South African economy, given this new regime that started on the 24th of April this year, for the inward and outward movement of money. But how does it affect the South African economy in terms of people that may have previously seen South Africa as not just not a tax haven, but a place friendly to their incomes in as far as tax is concerned?
Yeah, so, Aubrey, I would actually say it's a double-edged sword. And there's a reason for that. So, firstly, I mean, South Africa never really been a tax haven from an actual tax regime perspective. Guys have, to whatever avail possible, attempted to minimize their South African tax obligations, and that happens with the correct estate planning, proactive tax planning, etc. Now, if we look at it from a investment standpoint, let's do global first, and then we've got to do inbound, we've got to do outbound. So I may go a little bit over time here, but when we look at outbound investment, right, that's where your AIT is the issue.
Yeah.
Now, you can look at it from two perspectives. You can say, okay, if it's more difficult to take money out, which obviously is the aim of the process implementation, it's more difficult to take money out, more money should stay in, therefore the South African economy should stabilize. Now, that would be the layman's understanding, right?
Yes.
But actually, what it means, and I've actually run this by my fiance as well. I had a chat with her a couple of weeks ago. She's in management accounting for one of these multinationals. And what they're seeing practically is quite the opposite. So because it is a more stringent process to send funds out, it means less offshore investing from South Africans. Now, that's,
and I suppose that diminishes that
the foreign
tax
gross income base.
Yeah,
Correct.
the tax net for
That
global income.
Correct. Yes, absolutely correct. Because, I mean, remember, rand volatility, you are investing offshore because it's not that hard to get money out of SA historically. You're investing offshore. You are earning interests, dividends, if you've got some shares, etc., foreign currency. Coming back into South Africa, granted that the hedging on the actual conversion itself is not unfavorable, but you could then make a further profit on that. So you're making a profit on a profit, granted that you have the correct hedging protection with either a CFC or a Forex account or whatever you've elected for. Because we see, even on our side, when we set up those CFC or Forex accounts, it's got a bit of a hedging protection measure that mitigates the currency fluctuation of the rand. Now, when that money comes back in, or even if the money stays offshore, and it's the same for something intangible. So if you're looking at CFD or you're investing in crypto assets, etc., when you look at it from that perspective, and I know for myself, I look at it from a tax perspective, a legal perspective, an accounting perspective, regulatory, especially the FDI and AFTA and what implications these trade agreements have, etc.
Yeah.
And it really becomes a case of when you have the foreign investment, you earn in foreign currency. That is foreign currency coming into South Africa, which is literally a boost to the economy. But if you are strengthening tax treatment, to use the precise wording of the 2020 budget review, if you are strengthening tax treatment by increasing verification measures at the very base, so before the money gets out, not even when it's coming back in, before it gets out, you're implementing these measures. You are going to, one, deter South Africans from offshore investment, and two, you are going to deter any offshore investors from investing in South Africa, because to get their money back out, they're now going to have a problem if it stays here too long or it goes into a specific type of listed equity, unlisted equity, some sort of investment, joint venture.
Yeah.
Venture capital's kind of done. There was a sunset clause years ago here in SA, but venture capital around the world still in existence. And you're deterring these guys to an extent, because remember, as we said, they're non-resident. So if they're putting $10 million into this amazing project in South Africa that, in 4 years will yield fantastic results and they're going to get $50 million out, suddenly they're faced with the fact that, okay, so processing, I invested in a South African project, the profit on the South African project, okay, so if I want to get that profit back out, how is that done? Okay, is there a trust ultimately at the top of the structure? Will it come out as a distribution? Will it just be a payment? Is this going to be a cash transfer? Is it going to be the disposal of my shares in that particular project? And let's say it's a disposal of your shares. You as the foreign investor, 5 years from now, must now think about, okay, shit, now there's this new AIT PIN. Okay, does that mean I've got to register with SARS in 5 years' time to get my profit back out? What about my dividend distributions, my quarterly dividend distributions? And I mean, and that's from a tax standpoint.
Let me go back to.
Then you've got to look at the accounting standpoint, balancing the books. It becomes messy, and ultimately, my thoughts on the economic impact is it is going to harm the economy more than anything else, because it decreases South African residents investing offshore and then reaping the interest on those investments, the dividends, etc., as income feeding the South African tax base. And secondly, it does act as a slight deterrent over and above the grey listing for foreign investors to now invest into South African projects.
Delano, as we come to a close, I suppose the uneducated question is, of the money that comes into the fiscus, how much of it, relatively speaking, comes from that global net of income from people who are tax resident in South Africa? How much of that net income that goes into the fiscus, that builds our roads, that does all of that, comes from that? And to what extent does this new regime increase or diminish that money that our fiscus needs so desperately?
So I think if we're looking for a more precise number, you'd actually get it from Jashwin as opposed to me. But if I can just give a comment on what is the greater impact, if any, on this new regime. Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty for many South African tax residents, as well as those who have been abroad and are not entirely familiar as to whether they've actually seized their tax residency factually or not. And if there is harm to come from this, from an economic standpoint, it's certainly, in my view, something that could link to individuals being deterred on whether they should be making investments in South Africa. Because when it comes to the inward and outward flow of money, you don't want to be bound by heavy regulations, strict red tape. It often makes things difficult. If you struggle to transact, you struggle to economically be active and quicker from a growth perspective. I think that's my comment. Jashwin certainly would know the numbers a bit better than me.
Give us a sense, Jashwin, as to the amount of money that our fiscus gets from that global taxation system that comes from being a tax resident for people who have income from other parts of the world.
So, holistically, if we want to look at it, the taxation revenue, was it last year's budget speech? For some reason, I remember those stats better than this year's budget speech. But we were looking at about 300 billion. But remember, there's always a difference between what should be the tax contribution and what is the tax contribution and what is the fiscus's target, and then there's a deficit. And is there a collection shortfall? Have they over-collected but still underperformed in terms of their budget? And that's what's been happening for the last couple of years, because I'll be quite frank, I mean, I see their budget docs. Budget is a projected collection is 75% of budget, and then when they hit 80% of their projection, which is in short, it's a big celebration. Whoop-de-doo, we collected above what we projected, but you're still 20% short of budget. So let's call it a pothole in the fiscus, because we know those damn things never get filled. But that pothole in the fiscus has been there pre-COVID, got deeper during COVID.
Do you think, Delano, we are sufficiently aware of the ramifications of this new tax regime? Do you think that South Africans in general, are aware of the implications of this situation and what it could mean to the economy, given some of the strains that may exist in the movement of money in and out?
I don't think so. I think there's a large group of the population, as you mentioned earlier, not even familiar of, what are these concepts, tax resident, non-tax resident, and is it perhaps a conversation that only appeals to a certain level of people who have certain amounts to actually regard these concepts as relevant to their daily life. But more than that, I mean, it would have been great also to hear from listeners, what their perspective is from these comments and the discussion we've had, because it would give insight, whether it be on a small scale or not, as to whether this is something that's known widespread. But from my point, I don't think it is.
I think we need more such conversations, gentlemen. Jashwin Baijoo, I really appreciate your time. Head of Strategic Engagement and Compliance at Tax Consulting SA. Delano Abdoll, Team Leader and Cross-Border Taxation Expert at Tax Consulting SA. How do people get in touch with you, Delano and Jashwin, if they want to have these conversations a little more in detail?
So on my side, my email address is delano@taxconsulting.co.za. Spelled DELANO, and my contact number is 083 66 11048.
Jashwin?
Cool. Thanks, Delano. Thanks, Aubrey. So on my side, very much haven't changed my email address or cell number since our last chat. So it's contactable 083 379 227. Aubrey, actually, off the back of our last chat, one of the guys, I think you'll remember that Kele payment mechanism. Yeah, he popped me a WhatsApp. Good chat with him. But yeah, and then email address is jashwin@taxconsulting.co.za.